Hey friend, it's Michael, and I've got a question for you. How well do you take feedback, both positive and negative? Welcome to the follow up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore how we communicate well. What we have been taught about communication and what has been modeled and incentivized through our culture has left us in a place where we know how to exert our ideas and opinions and beliefs onto each other, but we miss the other half of conversation, the extraction. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before. To teach you how to ask curious questions, how to seek understanding over certainty, and how to listen and give space so that ultimately you might become a better communicator. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and what we stand for, rather than what we are against. It seems everyone has an opinion about everything these days. Now, have you ever thought about how often that phrase is thrown out like it's a bad thing? You're a human being. Of course you have opinions. No one is ever going to change the fact that we humans form opinions easily and often. The bigger issue, in my humble opinion, is that you are exposed to more people's opinions and feedback and ideas than ever before. You're bombarded, seemingly, from all directions, constantly. You pick up your phone and there's a stream of social media notifications just waiting on you to consume a collection of random people's thoughts and feelings about the goings-on of the day. You open your computer and there are emails and Slack messages chock full of feedback on projects and proposals and presentations. You turn on your TV and, my goodness, it sometimes seems like everyone is just shouting whatever comes to mind to whomever wants to hear it. The feedback loop, all too often, feels like a feedback fire hose. And just like a fire hose, there's a missing element from all of this feedback: care for what or who is on the receiving end. When you spray a fire hose at a fire, you don't care about the collateral damage that occurs, the waterlogged carpets or the damaged furniture. You just want the fire out. Would you agree that far too often these days, feedback and opinions are blasted about without much care? I've got my point to prove, and I need to show how smart I am. Well, as you'll hear from this episode's guest, while you're so busy trying to prove how smart you are, you're not learning anything. And if you're not learning anything, are you really all that smart? Jason Rosoff is the CEO and co-founder of an organization called Radical Candor, which he started with Kim Scott, who wrote the book Radical Candor. Jason and I discuss just what Radical Candor is. But at its core, it's about delivering important feedback, and yeah, opinions, while demonstrating care, especially when you don't know the other person. Jason describes some very real fears we all have: our fear of being known, our fear of having the things we care about dissected by others, and he outlines just how important delivering feedback with care can be to helping others not immediately get consumed by their emotions and feelings. I heard you say in a previous interview that we're afraid to be known, and that leads us to not coming into situations inviting radical candor into how we communicate with each other. So
Hmm.
I would love to understand, Jason, what did you mean by that?
It's a really good question, and I think it's a good question for a couple of reasons. One, I wasn't trying to be cryptic, so I appreciate the chance to clarify. And two, because I think it's at the heart, it really is at the heart of a lot of the challenges that we experience, not just in the workplace, but in our relationships. I think the whole idea of making ourselves vulnerable in front of the people that we care about, by making our perspectives known, our points of view known. I think people often think that if I'm telling you what I think, that that could be like an act of dominance or me sort of trying to assert myself. But for many people, if they're telling you what they really think, not just sort of the polished message version of what they think, but if they're telling what you really think, that is a truly vulnerable act, because the risk exists that if the person responds to you thinking that that's the polished version and you get into this sort of like intellectual disagreement, you're taking a real risk that it could be very painful, right? To have someone say, I see what you're saying, and I'm taking this as an opportunity, and I'm not treating it as you revealing something important about yourself. What I'm treating it as an intellectual exercise. And it'd be very painful to have something that really matters to us sort of dissected intellectually. So that's what I mean by we're afraid to be known, even when it's about sharing our own opinion. And then the reverse is also true. It's very I mean, we've all had the experience of someone that knows us very well holding up a mirror for us, and that's what I think of is what's really happening when we solicit feedback from others. So first thing I was talking about was sharing our perspective with others. Now I'm talking about getting others to share their perspectives with us. When we solicit feedback from other people, there's this voice in the back of our head that often says something like, I as much as I would love to know what they really think, I'd prefer to know that they like me. And I think because there's something so deeply rooted in our biology and psychology, which is the need to belong, right? That is like a fundamental human need. And when someone shares their perspective with us, especially if we really value that person and our relationship with that person, and they're critical of us, the fear is that underlying that criticism is a desire to sort of cast us out of the tribe. You know what I'm saying? Like
Hmm.
to say we're not worthy of being a part of the group to which we so desperately want to belong. And when I say group, it doesn't have to be a team or a society. It could just be two people. A relationship is a group, and like to know that you're seen and valued and understood in that relationship is a fundamental human need. So that's what I was referring to, and I was like, we have this fear of being known. The problem with those things is that it's sort of omnipresent, meaning it's happening at the level of sort of like hardware and like low level software in the human brain, this desire to belong and this fear of being cast out, which means that it impacts almost every interaction that we have with other people. And it becomes especially potent when we're talking about either giving feedback to somebody else or soliciting feedback from somebody else about our behavior or our work.
Is the context of all of this skewed towards the negative? Criticism, being challenged, giving some sort of negative feedback to someone? Or is there a concept or a world where this is also in the positive?
Yeah, I, I think I'll just speak for myself for a moment. I think sometimes it's
Yeah.
very hard for me to accept positive feedback from other people. And that is because I have a cultural experience, like an upbringing that in which people were just encouraged to sort of deflect to the positive things that they had done, and to focus on the areas that they could improve. And I do think that that attitude is responsible for a lot of like a lot of the success in my life. So I don't want to completely pan it, but I do recognize that for some people who are not used to being truly sort of understood, even if the understanding is positive, it can be painful because it it sort of puts you in the spotlight. And I think there's a lot of people who feel fundamentally uncomfortable, having the gaze of the people that they value fall on them. Like that's just a fundamentally uncomfortable thing. It doesn't matter what you are saying. But I will say it is much more likely to be uncomfortable when the perspective is negative than when the perspective is positive. Like you're better off um, sharing, making sure that it's important that you make sure that the ratio of sort of positive observations to negative observations is at least greater than one. And I think in a great relationship, um, working or otherwise, it should be much higher than one, right? The positive should significantly outweigh the negative.
Where did you grow up, Jason?
I grew up in New York, in the U.S., just outside New York City, and lived there until I was about 30 years old, and then I moved to California, and I lived in the Bay Area for a dozen years or so, and I just recently moved back to the East Coast, and I'm in coastal Connecticut now, southeastern Connecticut.
I'm very curious about what you just said in terms of that feeling of having that praise directed towards you when you've been brought up to be more focused on what you can improve. What's been true for you? What's been true for you in your life that was fostered? And how does that relate to how other people might experience that?
I mean, I think this is a very common American experience, that we compare ourselves to others. Number one, so like we measure ourselves, again, against the performance of other people. We do that in lots of different ways. You know, if you were a part of the American public education system, you took these tests and the test said you're in X percentile. You know what I'm saying? So like you did better than 75% of people, but worse than 25% of people, kind of a thing. There's this fundamental sort of scale balancing thing that people do. And even if you're not American, it is a human instinct to compare ourselves and our experience to other people. So I think that part of it is fairly universal. Um, I think part of it was like the sort of like my family culture, but part of it was also like the educational system that I grew up in.
Mhm.
I It was fairly clear that I had some like education related aptitude, early in my life, and so I was encouraged by other people to like push myself and work harder, and I think that really stuck with me. My mom's also an educator, a teacher, and I think she really wanted us to. I have a brother and a sister. Like she really wanted us growing up to know that we had almost limitless possibility. Like she believed in us fully, and she wanted us to be able to be successful. Um, and I think for me, it wasn't so much like someone told me that it was going to be this way, but I found it was adaptive. Like I found that um, I was able to increase my performance because I was doing relatively well already, in school, especially. I was able to increase my performance faster by focusing on my deficits than by focusing on my strengths. And I
Mm.
think one of the reasons, a- and I think that is true for people who are successful, it is often helpful to focus on like the areas the sort of marginal areas that you can improve. um, that is often helpful. But for people who are struggling, it is often harmful to focus on the areas where they have deficits, and much more helpful to focus on areas where they're succeeding. And one of the things I've sort of learned over the course of my life is that I'm not always doing relatively well. There are some things that I try that I'm not very good at. And that process of focusing on the negative actually was a detriment in those situations.
That nuance that you just shared there, Jason, do you have an example of how that's been true in your life?
Yeah. So I think I'll give you like a physical example.
Sure.
So I ran cross country in high school, and for the
I did too.
okay. So for the audience who may not know, this is these sort of like medium distance races, like somewhere between 2.5 and 5.5 miles is like probably the average. And often they're not run on their courses that might go through the woods or like these other places. They're often not run on, so it's not like track and field kind of a thing. Even though every occasionally we would run a race on like a 1/4 mile loop, that was very rare. And so you're sort of by yourself when you're doing this activity. You know what I mean? Like you're kind of like off in the woods, and maybe you're running with a pack of other people, but it's very hard to sort of measure your relative progress until you get to the end, or unless you have like really clear mile markers and you know what you're trying to hit. In any case, I'm not the fastest person. Like I just I was in incredibly good shape. Um, And uh, but I'm just not fast. Like I'm not a fast person. But what I do have is an endurance. And so here's the problem. I was like pitting myself against these really fast people who just like biologically better off than I was for running cross country. Um, and I was like, how do I make myself faster? And I like was working out really hard and doing all this other stuff, and I was really seeing no progress. I was getting really, really um, discouraged. Basically, I was like, I'm never going to be good at this. And then what I realized was uh, there I was focusing on the wrong thing. I was trying to be fast in the beginning and the middle of the race, but my endurance allowed me to be faster than other people at the end of the race. And so I switched from focusing on the negative to focusing on the positive, which is like, what is this asset that I have? Which is like, I get to the end of the race and I often have more in the tank than the people who are running near me, which means that if I save up a little bit, I can really push myself at the end of the race and I can improve my performance. And it was the difference. It was shocking as I started to do that more and more, which was don't focus on being the fastest. Don't try to get into that front pack. Really focus on reserving your energy for the second half of the race. Like my performance improved dramatically. I still had a ceiling, so I'm not going to say
Yeah.
like now I'm an Olympic runner. Like I still had a biological ceiling. Like I'm just not that fast of a person. Um, but I was able to improve my race performance significantly by focusing on what I did have, which was extra gas in the tank at the end of the race.
I did not expect that we would be having a conversation about cross country, which was my sport in high school. So I'm right there with you. I know what you mean by that. I was not particularly fast, but I had endurance, much like you too, Jason. I loved cross country. Well, let's
Yeah,
loop this back around to radical candor, shall we?
sure.
So something that you said in there, though, in a previous answer that I want to bring it back to is, and I've heard you say this before, this experience of not wanting true radically candid feedback or giving radically candid feedback is a learned behavior. Do I have that correct?
Yes, I think, and the reason I know this is because people who have different life experiences have different relationships with radical candor and the idea of giving and receiving it. Like it's very clearly that very clear to me in my experience and also in hearing the stories of other people that there are different levels of tolerance on both ends of the spectrum, both for giving and receiving uh, radical candor. And one thing that I know is that while it's hard to undo the training that we had from a very young age or the cultural training that we get as we continue into adulthood, it is not impossible to outcreate the bad habits that we've learned when we are younger. And the reason that I know that is like, there have been periods of time in my life where I've been much heavier than I am today, and that had a lot to do with bad habits, right? Like I had a bad relationship with food, I had a bad relationship with activity, and when I changed that relationship, I changed my behavior changed, and the outcome also changed. And I've done that a lot in like the intellectual endeavor of radical candor too, intellectual and emotional endeavor of radical candor. um, I As I said, like I had some success as a student, and when I graduated, especially from undergraduate, um, I, I sort of had this chip on my shoulder about being smart. like I was frequently, among the smartest people in a room as a student, and I got out into the workforce, and I had the good fortune of working with people who were much smarter than me. And it was really hard for me. Like I wanted to get, I was constantly sort of like getting defensive or like debating instead of saying, wow, what an amazing opportunity. I'm in the room with these like incredibly accomplished people. They're like subtle thinkers. There's so much that I could learn from them. But I feel like I wasted 5 years of my life, like getting into fights with them basically. And what I realized, the trigger for me that got me to reflect on this was the emotional toll that it was taking. Like I didn't like the person that I was in those situations. And so
Mm.
I started the process of trying to outcreate this habit that I had gotten into of like trying to prove to everybody how smart I was. And I would say I've mostly succeeded. I've mostly succeeded at this. I've fall back into some patterns every once in a while, but what has opened up for me is the ability to learn an incredible amount from people, and not just people who are sort of book smarter than I am, but people who have different life experience than I do. Um, and when I find myself sort of trying to prove how smart I am, I ask the question, well, what aren't you learning? If you want to be really smart, like you have to always be learning. If you're proving how smart you are, you're probably missing something of value. And so that sort of gets me back into a place where I can remind myself that it is up to me to outcreate the habit that I built, even though it's like very ingrained in me. And it was like a process of 20 years of education. I developed that habit. Well, in the second 20 years of my life, I've been unwinding it, and to great benefit.
So radical candor then, in leading up to obviously the work that you do now. Candor is, well, I'll just ask you the question. Why radical candor? Why do we have to have the radical in place of candor? Why is candor not just simply enough, being direct and being forthright with your thoughts, critiques, criticisms?
Yeah, I think so. Kim is my business partner. Kim Scott is my business partner. She wrote the book Radical Candor, and she gets all the credit for titling it Radical Candor. I think Radical Candor is a brilliant title for a book. And Kim's intent in titling the book Radical Candor was not to modify um, candor, but to describe the experience of
Mm,
receiving um, candor along with care. That it One of the definitions of radical is rare,
mm,
like unusual, and so that's the intent of the word radical. It is also the experience when you meet someone, especially who's able to give really good radically candid critique or criticism. um, it's a unique experience because, like, on the one hand it sort of stings, and on the other hand you feel simultaneously grateful and sort of understood and appreciated, which is not how most of us feel when we are criticized. Like, most of the time what we feel when we are criticized is, this person's a jerk, they don't understand anything, and I don't want to, and maybe like our inner rebel starts to come out, like I don't want to do what they're suggesting. um, and so from my perspective, that's the value of the word radical, is to describe the experience of actually receiving the care personally and challenge directly at the same time.
You've mentioned it twice. Care with candor.
Yeah.
What does that look like in practice?
Yeah, I think if Kim were here, she would caution us that sometimes candor is care. Like, sometimes there's no daylight between those two things. Meaning, sometimes someone tells us something, and we know that the only reason they would tell us that thing is because they cared about us. There's nothing in it for them. You know what I'm saying? So even if they're being quite direct, and maybe like an outside observer might not say, "Oh, there's a ton of care in that conversation," we still feel like we still experience that as an act of generosity. So I would just I would say that that's why she called the other thing challenge directly and not candor. So she created the two by two with the care personally on the vertical axis and challenge directly on the horizontal axis. And over the last many years, what I've come to appreciate is that there are several sort of pathways for us to show care. If this is a long established relationship, um, we often show care. We think about it as sort of like making deposits in the relationship bank. You know what I mean? Like, we show care because we're interested and curious about that person's life, not just what they're like as as a partner on a project or something like that. We are interested in helping that person achieve their goals and develop in the ways that they want to. We're invested in their success. So we have, in long-term relationships, we have these opportunities to show care by investing in the relationship with that person beyond the sort of immediate work product that we might be working on together. And so that way, when the challenge comes, often what we're doing is we're relying on the deposits we've made in the relationship bank to say, how much I appreciate you, and both as a person and as a partner in the work that we do together. And so I'm sharing this with you because I'm hoping that it's going to help you grow. Um, But if we have that long-term relationship, we've demonstrated that care, and we're allowed some shorthand. I've shared this story before, but um, when I started at Khan Academy, which is where I was before co-founding Radical Candor with Kim,
Hmm.
I came to that organization with a partner. So Ben Kamens and Ben was the head of engineering and I was the head of product. And we had this experience where we'd worked together at that point already for 5 years. We would get into these debates and it would be like, they would be heated and we'd be sharing ideas. Um, and someone on the team said to me, you know, it's hard for us because it's sort of like it feels like, when your parents are fighting, you're having these debates and it sort of feels like when your parents are fighting. And I sort of brushed that off. I was like, you know, maybe this, maybe that seems like an overreaction. But then one day Ben and I were out on the street having one of these debates, and a police officer like turned his lights on and like pulled the car over and stuck his head out the window and said, "Hey, is everything okay here?" And it was at that point that I realized, okay, maybe there was something to what my teammate was saying, that the this, even though it doesn't feel to us as though um, we're fighting, right? It feels to us as like it feels supportive to us, or we enjoy engaging with each other in this way. It There might be something to what other people are saying. Like maybe there's another way to approach this. It doesn't have the same appearance or impact on other people. And that was an interesting moment because I felt care and challenge, but other people didn't, and it was causing some people to be disconcerted. And as a leader, it was important, as leaders for both. It was important to both of us that people understood without having to sort of be deeply involved in our relationship. They could see that care between us, and so we were more intentional about that um, uh, going forward. But there's also ways just in the moment to recognize, to show care, even if we have to challenge somebody. And I think when it's positive, um, when we're sharing something positive with somebody, I would say it's harder to show the challenge sometimes than it is to show the care. And
Yeah.
so if I were to say, hey, Michael, I noticed at the beginning of the call you did a really great job of setting the stage for me and helping me understand what the show is going to be like. And my encouragement to you is like, what I really want you to do is to know how positive an impact that had on me so that you feel encouraged to continue to do that again in the future. And I think being that specific is often sort of like hard for people or somewhat uncomfortable for people, but it's really useful to be that specific, because if I just said, hey, I really enjoyed the start of the show, that was great, it's hard to know what to do with that, right? So that's why it's sometimes hard to get to the challenge directly on the positive side of things. And you might feel good about that, and I might feel good about that. Even that sort of short, like, hey, it was really great. Like we both might feel pretty good about that, but did we learn anything from it? Not sure. The other side is like if I was to criticize something, so I'll flip it and say, like, if you were to say to me, "Hey, Jason, I noticed that you showed up a couple of minutes late to the start of the recording today, um, and I understand schedules are busy, but it would be really helpful to me to get started on time because there's a lot that I want to cover with you, and I know the audience would really appreciate hearing from you." Uh, and to me, the care personally comes in the like, hey, I recognize that things are crazy and schedules get busy and it's hard to be on time. But I would
Mhm.
also appreciate knowing like that there's a lot to cover, and a couple of minutes might matter in the end. And that's a good reminder to me. So that would feel like care personally and challenge directly to me. Um, right. Cause you're not blaming me. You're just saying like, I'm letting you know this is what would be helpful.
Sure.
Um, and so that's like a practical example of like a way that you could really quickly, even if you don't know the person, establish some baseline for human respect and understanding, but still be clear about what it is that the person could do more of or do less of.
In those moments, Jason, like you just described, had I actually said that to you, you even referenced it earlier. We have this immediate response to deflect or say, ah, they're wrong. They're just like coming after me.
Yeah.
How do we recognize and respond to those initial feelings in a way that doesn't feel dangerous to us. And I use that word very specifically, dangerous.
Hmm.
And I could explain why, but yeah, how do we acknowledge and respond to those initial feelings?
Well, I'll give you a quick response, and then I would love to know why you chose that word. So, my quick response is our feelings are a thing that happen. They're not who we are.
Hmm.
Like our feelings are we are not our feelings. And the one of the illustrations of this that's been very helpful to me is there's a Zen Buddhist philosopher named Thich Nhat Hanh, and he has this really great Dharma talk where he describes how um, when we're feeling a very strong emotion, it's like when you see a tree in a storm. And if you look at the top of the tree, excuse me, you look at the top of the tree, it's blowing wildly, right? Like there's all of this motion in the top of the tree. And you see it and you see that you think the tree is very vulnerable, right? The tree is in danger. Um, but if you look down and you look at the trunk of the tree and at the roots of the tree, you see something very different. You see the tree is very stable. The tree is rooted in the ground. The tree is very unlikely to be toppled, by the storm. And that has been a really helpful image to keep in my mind when I'm feeling
Yeah.
the sort of like turbulence of emotion, to be like, but I am grounded. I am safe. I'm okay. Like what this person is saying to me, it doesn't have to harm me. I don't have to allow what they're saying to me to harm me. Um, and it's even easier to do that when you know that the person cares about you, when they've demonstrated to you that they care about you, when you can honestly say to yourself, and I know it's not this person's intention to cause me harm. That self-reflection, I'm still rooted and I'm okay, is one thing that's really helpful for me. So like being in the moment, right? This is the idea of practicing mindfulness, is to recognize what's really going on. And so I will often say, I will articulate, I am feeling very vulnerable.
Mm,
I am feeling very vulnerable, or I feel really frustrated after hearing that feedback. Like I need to, it's helpful to not to say I am frustrated, but to specifically say I am feeling frustration. Um, that has been a really helpful practice to me. I will say the
yeah.
other thing that I do when I'm sort of stuck in emotion is I try to remember to breathe. This seems like a very simple thing to do, but there's all these pictures, all these studies that have been done, and the video and the sort of photos are almost comical, of people being put in situations where they're made to feel vulnerable, and they literally close up and stop breathing. Like they'll cross their arms and they'll sort of like dip like their shoulders will come up, like they get into a defensive posture and they restrict their breathing. Their respiration rate goes down. And the problem with all of this is like that there's a it's a feedback loop. There's a biofeedback loop that happens there, which is like the more defensive our posture becomes, the lower our respiration rate, the higher the release of the sort of stress hormones like cortisol and things like that. And
Hmm.
then our body gets into this like chain reaction, which people refer to as like fight or flight, fight, flight, or freeze, fight, flight. There's debate about whether there's more stages of it than that. Um, and all of that can be helped by taking 3 intentional breaths. So if I'm feeling overwhelmed by an emotion, if I feel sort of hurt by something that someone has said, I will often take a moment and literally count my breaths. So I'll take 3 full in and out breaths before I respond. And I've always thought that before I started that practice, I had this bias that people would see that as me, trying to come up with a response or sort of like being defensive. And what I learned is that most people interpret that as being thoughtful. So like not only am I giving myself time to process, but like I'm getting points from the other person for like taking time to think about what I would want to say instead of immediately responding.
I like that. Keep a little tally in the back of your mind. I'm getting
Yep.
points here.
Yeah.
uh, let's be really direct, Jason. How is radical candor compared to I just tell it like it is? You've kind of referenced the care aspect, which I can assume you'll go to that. But what are the hallmarks and trademarks of radical candor that make it different than just speaking your mind, telling it like it is? Being brutally honest is another phrase that you hear thrown out there. What makes it different?
Well, I I, I want to go. I want to like go one layer underneath care. Like in order for you to care about somebody else, you have to recognize the value of that person and consider them like what they need, not just what you need. I think that's the primary difference between radical candor and the other terms that you threw around, is that the other terms that you threw around are fundamentally self-focused.
Mm, mhm.
Um, I tell it like it is. Um, I'm just sharing the, I'm just telling you the truth. Like those are all self-focused. Those are all entirely self-focused stances. Brutal honesty also, like the word brutality is in it. Like you're not brutal to someone. You care, like you've taken time to consider what they need. Like no one needs brutality. That is not a thing that that is needed by human beings. So uh, I think that's the primary driver. Uh, I think care is sort of one level up from that. So I see it as like common human decency and respect is the sort of floor. And I don't think brutal honesty engenders perpetuates common human decency and respect. Brutal honesty diminishes our sense of decency, our sense of respect for one another.
Why is it so easy to jump to that?
I mean, I wish I knew. Like maybe there's a book in there. I'm sure that people have written about this. I think one of the reasons is that sort of like biofeedback runaway train of like chemicals and emotions. You know what I mean? Like just the the fundamentally hard parts of being human is like living in the hardware and software, right? Because I don't think people don't talk about that part as much as I wish they would, which is our hardware, like our bodies do a bunch of stuff that has a direct impact on our cognition, and it's all without our consent. You know what I'm saying? And for the most part, it's really helpful. Like it helps keep us alive. It helps defend us from outside invaders, like our immune system and all this other stuff. Like that hardware. Like I love my hardware. Like I'm very grateful for it. But every once in a while, I'm like, man, this hardware was designed for a world that doesn't really exist anymore. Um, I'm not constantly under the threat of starvation. Like I'm not constantly under the threat of physical harm from either my environment or the people who I'm working alongside. Like that is not the world I live in anymore. But my hardware was designed for that world, and so some of the things that happened are a result of that. So I think that leads us away from radical candor, because radical candor requires cognition. Radical candor requires us engaging the slow thinking part of our brain to distinguish what I think, what I feel, what I think the other person thinks, and what I think the other person feels. Like that is slow. That is the slow part of our brain. We don't get there
Right,
automatically. We have to
right.
slow down to think about that, and that's Kahneman's idea, right? The thinking
Yeah.
fast and slow. Um, and sometimes it's hard. You know what I'm saying? Sometimes the train has left the station, and you're just on board for the ride. And so, what I would say is, I think it is easy to go there in part, especially when we care. So, I think one of the things that sort of feels oxymoronic sometimes, is that it's easy to wind up in obnoxious aggression when you really care about something, but you forget to show that you care about the people in that situation.
Mm.
Right. So imagine a situation where, for example, um, you strongly disagree with with a decision that someone else on your team has made. Right. Let's say they decided to send out this email, um, and promoting a product that you didn't think was quite ready to be promoted. Um, and you got into this discussion with them about whether or not the thing should happen. And it was clear that they disagreed with you. It was also clear that you didn't have the power to change the decision, right? It was their choice to whether to send this email or not. It's really easy to imagine oneself in that situation becoming so frustrated that you, instead of being radically candid, you're sort of obnoxiously aggressive. And you say, well, if you send that email, all this, and this terrible thing are going to happen. And I'm not going to be there to help you because this isn't my choice. This is your choice. And it's sort of forgivable. You know what I mean? I find it easy to have compassion for someone who finds themselves in that situation. And so
Mm.
the reason why Kim wrote care personally and not just care is because it's important to remember that it's about, for radical candor to exist, it has to be about the relationship. It's not just caring about the work, it's caring about the people who do the work.
A lot of what you just described there is why earlier I referenced and used the word dangerous.
Hmm.
As I understand it from people much smarter than I, our body can't tell the difference between a a verbal attack, hit to our ego, if you will, and an actual physical threat to ourselves, or our brain can't, or is not great at distinguishing between the two. So, a critique of you and a hit to your ego feels physically threatening. I
Hmm.
believe I have that correct, which is why I use the word dangerous because it feels that way.
Yep.
And I want to ask you, in the work that you do, Jason, is that level of care that you just described there in your answer, is that harder to come by these days
Hmm.
with virtual work being much more prevalent, with a lot of our interactions socially being on social media and not physically face to face, although that's changing and improving. Is it harder to come by these days in your experience?
I mean, speaking personally, no. Uh, I don't think it's harder to come by. I think what is true is that the patterns that we had for developing strong relationships are being upended by, especially at work, are being upended by changes in work. And I don't think those changes are over. I think, in fact, I think it's about to get a lot more confusing with the addition of AI into,
Yeah.
especially like large language models and generative AI into the work that we do. Um, I've seen some conservative estimates that say that in the next 5 years, AI will touch 50% of all jobs. Like 50% of all working people will have some level of interaction with AI on a regular basis. But what I do think is true is that the fundamentals of relationships have not changed. Like, relationships are about time and attention, right? Like, there's no way to efficiently develop a relationship with somebody. I mean, and I don't think that dating sites would disagree, right? Like, the algorithms do this matching thing, so they try to find like characteristics that might make us more likely to connect. But they stop at, like, we don't know how to actually make you connect. Like, you have to figure out how to connect with that other person, and the way that you connect with them is time and attention, right? Like, you have conversations with them, whether that's mediated by technology or whether you actually get together in person to have those conversations, TBD. But like, you need to put in the time in order to develop the relationship. And I think that's the part that is made harder. So I don't think the human connection is harder to come by. What I think has been strained is our default patterns for the ways that we develop those relationships in the past don't work anymore. And because we're distributed, there's this idea, like, and because we're, at least in the US, are obsessed with efficiency,
Hmm.
we've created a situation in which people don't have much time. They do not have time to invest in relationships. They can't rely on the sort of like casual interactions that they might have had if they were physically co-located in an office. And so what's missing is this sort of this a bridge that needs to be built to intentionally spending time with people where you might have gotten like that might have happened coincidentally in an office setting. And I think that's a fair, like, that's my argument. Like, I think we've we've relied very heavily on these sort of coincidental relationship building moments. Those are gone. We don't have a pattern. There's no known pattern for intentional relationship building moments, like scheduling those into our days and our week. It's not exactly it's not terribly difficult actually to do this. Like, um, but we don't have the pattern for it, and we are working in a world that is demanding more and more efficient uses of our time. And to an algorithm that's determining the efficiency of your work, spending time one on one with somebody looks highly inefficient. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Like, there's
Mhm.
a, and so I do see that tension. So it's not that humans have changed. It's not even that the work necessarily makes this harder. I think it's that we don't have these patterns. And I think as people, like, there was no quantification of that sort of coincidental time before. And so it's not easy to convince people that it is actually more efficient to schedule that time for relationship building than to avoid it.
Are there differences between the relationships and how long the relationship has been in place? And what I mean by that is it a bell curve? Does it get harder the longer the relationship has been in place? Is it harder to be radically candid with your mom versus your boss of 6 years? Is I guess what I'm asking.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. I don't think it's quite that simple. I think
It never is.
most of my working relationships, it has gotten easier to be radically candid with people over time. And I have many relationships that are that are going on, working relationships that are going on 20 years.
Yeah.
So I think it's getting I think there's mostly a positive trend there. I think the mom example is a good one because the nature of our relationship, I think, determines a lot of how easy or difficult it is to be radically candid with somebody, and the response that the other person often takes. So, like, not everybody's mom is open to criticism. Some people's moms are very defensive. So, even though, like, the relationship could withstand it, maybe it's really hard to give that person feedback. Same thing with our dads, right? Like, for the people who are lucky enough to have both parents around, I feel like there's always this question of, like, do I want to spend time, like working through this issue, or do I want to just sort of enjoy spending time with my with my parents? Like, there's a calculus that happens, but I think that happens in every relationship. And I think it's not in an absolute sense, it's not a bad thing, right? That we don't need to say everything that we think. Like, we should talk about the important things and let the not so important things slide. um, Regardless of whether it's a work relationship, a personal relationship. I feel like that's pretty good advice. Um, and I think the benefit of a long-term relationship is that we've built up some care personally, right? Like, that the person knows where we're coming from, which makes it easier to repair, but not easy if something goes wrong in a radically candid conversation.
As we begin to land things here a little bit, Jason, I want to ask, where does it go from here? Like, you and Kim have obviously co-founded this organization. Kim has written the book. You coach and train a lot of leaders and people to have these types of kind and clear conversations, I believe is how you all describe them.
Yep.
Where does it go? Like, is it just we've got to get better at this and that's what you're focused on? Or like, where are your sights at with this right now?
You're asking that question at an interesting time. We're recording this toward the end of 2023, and we're sort of thinking about next year and beyond. We're, like, starting the strategic planning process. Um, and so I'm feeling, like, very introspective about that question. But what I will say is that we have found consistently that people are not taught how to have conversations especially when you disagree. Like the the skill of sharing a perspective and soliciting somebody else's perspective, like no one is teaching this. Which is sort of astounding, right? Right? Like when I say it like that, you're like, how are we? How is this not a skill that we are like at every like there's a kindergarten version of this, and there's a middle school and a high school and a college and a professional version of this. Like, how is this not required learning, right? But it's not being taught. Like how to have a compassionate conversation with somebody, especially when you disagree, is not a skill that's being taught. And so I think to some degree, we are in the like, people just need to get better at this and they need time to get better at it and they need a reason to get better at it. Um, and I think we're trying to work on all of those things. Like people need help getting better at the skill. That's sort of what the company tries to do with its product and training and things like that. People need time to get better at it. You know, part of what we're doing is helping people understand what it actually takes in order the time, like how much time does it take to help someone improve on this. And I think there's a lot of unfortunately very unrealistic perspectives out there about how long it takes to, like I said, outcreate the habits that we have built over the course of our lives. And then the third thing is that people need a reason to change this behavior, and that is the I think that is an area that Kim and I are thinking quite a lot about, which is helping. We want to help managers and leaders understand their job better. I think there's a, this might be like entirely anecdotal, but I have felt this. There seems to be in the zeitgeist, there seems to be this sort of like reaction to the push of the last several years to focus on sort of like safety, especially psychological safety at work. There seems to be this sort of reactionary force, which is, you know, safety, like the focus on safety is like not encouraging us our best thinking or to like, anyway, I feel this tension rising, which is like, which is very interesting to me. And I think part of that tension arises out of leaders not fundamentally just misunderstanding or misapprehending the job that they have, which is to get the best out of people, right? Like the whole job of being a leader is to get leverage from your team, because if you can do everything better than everyone on your team, you have hired the wrong people and you don't really have a team at all, right? Like it sort of defeats the purpose. And I think people have misunderstood the idea of psychological safety to mean, you know, that they believe that in order to be psychologically safe, people can never disagree. When in fact, what we mean by creating an environment in which people feel safe to speak their mind is creating the environment where people can disagree and they can disagree wholeheartedly without being worried that they're going to be cast out of the tribe. And I think this is like the shift from command and control to knowledge work. It was like it's been going on for quite a while. I think we're much closer to this idea of you can't tell people what to do. That just doesn't work. Um, but people don't quite know how to do, like what the organization where you're not telling people what to do looks like. And I think, and so that's part of the job. So it's not just getting better at this skill. I think it's also helping leaders understand how, what your responsibility is and what kind of environment you're trying to create that's going to allow people to use the skill they have to express themselves in a compassionate way, to drive business, to drive your business, your team forward. And we're thinking about what we can do differently than we've been doing so far, which is sort of focusing on that skill development side of things that might help with that.
Jason, a lot of your answer there in so many ways parallels what I'm trying to do with this show to teach us how to communicate through conflict. It's what I wrote about in my book, Can I Ask a Question? It's what I talked about in my TEDx talks. It is that lack of education about what this stuff looks like. And I loved that answer and building up to people need a reason. What is your reason for putting in the time to teach these skills?
Yeah, I feel like part of my part of like my reason for existing, part of the thing that animates me is this desire to see people lead more fulfilled, especially work lives. I feel like I've seen so much damage done in my career by well intentioned or not so well intentioned um, leaders. And it makes me sad to think of like the loss of the increase in human suffering and the loss of human potential that is created by that is like it's just so depressing to me. Like I don't want I want to create through myself and my interactions with others. I want to create. I want to lay the foundation. Forget that. That's too arrogant. I want to lay a brick in the foundation of a world in which people do less damage to each other. And in an
Mm.
ideal world where we build it up to a place where not only are we doing less damage, but we're creating more compassion uh, and allowing people to truly reach their potential. Um, and I want that for my personal relationships. I want it for my work relationships, and I want it for our clients. Like I want everybody to live in a world where it's easier for those things to be true.
What is a question that you wish you were asked more?
I've been feeling a bit cynical lately, and I feel like the question that doesn't get asked of me very often is like, what do you do if you when you're just feeling done, when you just like screw it, I'm I'm out, I'm done with all of this, because I think a lot of people are feeling that way right now. I think a lot of people
Yeah.
are like opt out.
Yeah.
Where's the unsubscribe from this BS button? um yeah.
What do
Would you
you
like?
do? What do you do?
Well, a couple of things. One, I focus on what matters most to me, and that is like my relationships. So my family, my friends, my dog. Like I invest in those in the relationships that offer me nourishment, that give me something in return. Because I think one of the reasons why I feel done is when I feel like it's one sided. You know what I'm saying? When I feel like I'm putting in all the effort and I'm really getting nothing back. But sort of like the tree and the roots, it's important to remember that's not what every relationship is like. And so putting myself in the position to sort of bask in the glow of the positive relationships that I have and to see the positive effect that my choices can actually have on somebody else and have that be very direct is really helpful. So a meta way to put that is I take a big problem and I make it small.
Mm.
All these relationships and all this work that I'm doing, it's all BS. That's a big problem. None of it is worth it. Big problem. Can I have a good conversation with my partner, Jillian? You know what I'm saying? Like, can I do that? And if I can do that, it reminds me that it is not all wrong. It's not all bad. Um, and that is like one of the things that I do regardless of whether it's this work or anything else, when I'm feeling like everything is terrible and all of it's wrong, I just have to remind myself to look for what's right. Um, and that usually gets me out of my funk.
Jason, that is a wonderful place to leave it. Look for what's right. I love that advice and that perspective. Thank you so much for taking the time to join me here today, Jason. I appreciate it and love the work that you and Kim are doing.
Thanks so much, Michael.
I love what Jason said when he talked about how you can't appropriately respond to critique and criticism until you have had a moment to check in with yourself. He talked about intentional breaths, that your emotions are not you. I am versus I am feeling statements. All those things are a check in with yourself to understand how you're receiving this feedback. And if you don't do that, if you don't ask questions of yourself, it can be really difficult to respond in the most appropriate, the most helpful way to criticism, to feedback, to other people's opinions. This is what Jason was talking about when he talked about engaging the slow part of our thinking, an idea and a theory and a phrase made popular by Daniel Kahneman in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow. And on the flip side, I want to caution you, as we talked about in this entire conversation, this idea of being brutally honest, wearing that like a badge of honor, this idea of just telling it like it is, and all the different phrases that we have heard kind of collected into that phrase or that saying, that diminishes the other person's sense of decency and respect, and I'll say dignity. When you go in without that level of care for someone else. And I think we can all point out the times in our world today where we see over and over again people not taking care of the other person, the target of their feedback. You diminish your own sense of decency and respect and dignity as well as the other person. So engage that slow part of your thinking. Check in with yourself. Be intentional about your response and the care that you give someone else. I want to thank Jason for taking the time to join me here on the follow-up question. Please share this episode with your network and someone else, just even one person who you know who might find some value in listening to Jason and I's conversation here today on the topic of radical candor and taking care when delivering feedback. Also, please, wherever you're listening to the show, subscribe, leave a rating and review, let others know what you think of the show. And when you subscribe, you're never going to miss when a new episode drops. If you would like to get in touch with me or ask me a question or sign up for my newsletter or any of those things, check out my coaching. Go to my website, michaelashford.com, and poke around there, see what you think. Again, ask me questions. Or you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com if you're interested in anything that I've got going on around here. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.